Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to see everyone here on this beautiful October day. I'm going to introduce our speaker, Benjamin Nathans, in a second. First, I want to note that the bookshelf from Madeira, Ohio, is here selling copies of his books. It's a wonderful bookstore in Madeira, and they were quite happy to come up here and sell copies of Ben's books. Ben will sign copies after we talk here for a few minutes, so please do avail yourself of this opportunity to buy a book and get it signed from a Pulitzer Prize winner. Speaking of said prize winner, it's my pleasure to introduce Benjamin Nathans, who's the Alan Charles Kors Endowed Term Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania. Ben is the author of Beyond the Pale, The Jewish Encounter with Late Imperial Russia, which won the Koret Prize in Jewish History, the Vucinich Prize in Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies for the best book in the year in this field, and the Lincoln Prize in Russian History, also from the same organization. Beyond the Pale was also a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award in History. That level of award winning wasn't enough for Ben, so he wrote a second book, which we're all here today to hear about, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement, which also received the Vucinich Prize for Best Book in the Field, as well as the Zelnick Prize for Best History Book in the Field from the Association for the Study of East European and Eurasian Studies. It was awarded the 2025 Pushkin House Book Prize, and of course was awarded the 2025 Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction. It's a real pleasure to have Ben back here. Ben came to Miami in the spring of 2008 to give a talk in my colloquium series on Cold War culture. There were maybe about the same amount of people there in 2008 as now. On Alexander Volpin, the subject of the first chapter of this book, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause. So the way this is going to work is Ben opted for a conversation style. I will ask him a few questions. He'll answer them. I'll try to make it as softball-y as possible. We'll throw the floor open to the floor, so you can ask questions as well, and then there'll be time afterwards to buy books and have them signed by Ben. But first, let's join me in welcoming Ben Nathans back to Miami. Thank you. The book is an engrossing kaleidoscopic history of the Soviet dissident movement from its origins after Stalin's death to its demise in the early 1980s. I assume everyone here has read it cover to cover, so I don't have to go too far into this. The story involves a wide number of individuals who participated in protests, who typed up and spread banned text through what was called samizdat, or self-publishing, and talked a lot over kitchen tables. Talked a lot, read a lot, is one of the themes of this book. The dissident movement, quite to their own surprise, became something of a phenomenon both within and outside of the Soviet Union. It received headlines worldwide. It caused a lot of consternation for the Soviet leadership over the years. The strategy of the dissident movement, as one of their participants said quite clearly, was to try and live as a free person in an otherwise unfree society. So if the Soviet dissidents had a single creed, at least in the way that Ben tells it in the book, it was to live within the law, and by extension to live within truth. And to do so was also a way to point out how the Soviet state violated its own laws. Most of the dissidents you write about seem to believe that living within the law, living within truth, was an apolitical stance. The Chronicle of Current Events, which is the kind of Bible of the movement, this samizdat publication that just documented trials, unjust arrests, famously had a statement on every issue that said, this is not an illegal publication. So the first question I'm curious to hear you speak to, Ben, is this sincere? That is, the dissidents saying they were apolitical while doing these things, spreading underground text, writing about laws that were unjust. Were they sincere in this? Were they naive? Was it a tongue-in-cheek stance? How do you understand the dissidents of their own supposedly apolitical viewpoint?
Thank you. And more profoundly, thank you for bringing me here, Steve, for the second time. It's fantastic to be back in Oxford, and I'm just bowled over by how many people are in this room. Some of you must have been required to attend this. I can't imagine you're all here voluntarily. But let me get right to the question. It was an absolutely sincere belief. I think it's important to question what they understood political to mean. Political with a capital P, the affairs and the concerns of the state or the government. Political with a small case p, anything having to do with relations of power between human beings or between human beings and institutions. I think they really believed that by anchoring their grand strategy in Soviet law, that they were operating outside the realm of politics. And let me suggest something that will make that stance a little bit less outlandish, maybe for you and for people in the audience. If you had asked your average human rights activist in 1970 whether they thought human rights were a political category, they would have said no. Human rights are a moral category that are above politics. They transcend politics. As a matter of fact, they transcend the Cold War, which is why the dissidents and groups like Amnesty International thought they could have a dialogue in the 1970s without being implicated in the political force field of the Cold War. I myself don't think human rights are outside politics or above politics. They are implicated in questions of power. And I think in retrospect, the dissidents were naive to think that they could engage in the kind of activism that they were engaged in without being implicated in politics. But after I got over my initial shock at their claim of being apolitical, because they seemed like the most politically engaged people in their society, I realized they actually did mean it. They really did mean it.
A related question, should we only use the term dissident to apply to these Soviet people that acted apolitically? They didn't even like the word. Maybe you can say a few words about that. Or should it be a word that isn't just confined by time and place? Can anyone be a dissident if they act within the law and as a way of resisting it, or is that something we should just say is a Soviet phenomenon?
I think the cat is out of the bag. It can't just be a Soviet phenomenon because the word itself, the concept, has been applied to practically every society on the planet. You're right that the dissidents themselves, almost without exception, really didn't like that word. They didn't like being labeled with that word. And for a couple of reasons. One is, in Russian, it was just taken over as what they call a calque from English into Russian. And so the Russian word for dissident, good news for people learning Russian, is dissident. Not too hard to remember. But the problem with that word in the Russian setting is that it sounds and is foreign. And by using a foreign word to label those people, it only reinforced the government's message that they were all in cahoots with the CIA or other Western intelligence organizations. So that was one reason they didn't like it. But the other reason was, I think, subtler, and that is that historically, the word dissident came into the vocabularies of the languages that it entered as a term for religious sectarians. So Protestants in early modern France, a majority Catholic country, were dissenters. Quakers in the England of King Charles I were dissenters. Catholics in majority Protestant countries were often labeled dissenters. And even some of the Russian minority Christian sects in the 19th century were described in books of the time as dissidents. So it carried this image of religious sectarianism and of people who wanted to remove themselves from the majority population. And that's a very accurate use of the word because it is a Latin word originally, and in Latin, dissident means he who sits apart, who self-segregates from the rest of society. And that's a very bad description of what the Soviet dissidents were doing. As I said, they were obviously some of the most politically engaged people who were trying to start a conversation about issues of common concern in the Soviet Union. So just on a pure semantic level, the meaning of the word, it didn't work. So why did it stick? Because Western journalists who did so much to carve at least one version of the dissident story for the world public, the global public to consume, they latched on to this term. The KGB, the Soviet intelligence service, loved it because it emphasized their foreign connections, and so it stuck. Most of the people who got labeled dissidents would have much rather been known by the Russian term pravozащитники, or rights defenders. That's a very accurate, literal description of what they were trying to do. They were trying to make the rights that were already enshrined in the Soviet Constitution real, give them traction, make them a source of leverage. But that word didn't stick for one reason or another with foreign journalists. The other favored word among Soviet dissidents to describe themselves was, and this is a mouthful to say, so you're going to watch me struggle to pronounce it, inakomysлящие, which literally means other thinkers, people who think differently. You know, long before the commercial for Apple products, think different, poor grammar, but it's memorable, that was the way the dissidents thought about themselves. Okay, so that term was untranslatable, at least into English. And it was very inaccurate, because what distinguished the dissidents was not that they thought differently from the Communist Party. Plenty of people did that. It's that they acted on their thoughts, and they articulated their thoughts out loud. So the terminology is very tricky. I spent a long time struggling with what word I should use, or which of those words I should use in a responsible way. And in the end, I fell back on dissident because it is ubiquitous in the documents that I was working with. And it would have required, it would have given me a kind of verbal hernia to abstain from using the word dissident and use lots of substitutes for it. So I capitulated and I use it myself.
Anything to prevent verbal hernias, right? I mean, and thank goodness for the Western journalists so that we all can pronounce at least the word dissident. Right. The title of the book comes from a toast they gave to each other. The dissidents said they were engaging in a hopeless cause. They describe themselves often as Don Quixote-like. It comes up again and again in your book. And I was thinking about that and thinking about the fact that the dissidents received a fair bit of good press when they existed and for the years thereafter. And then it seems as though in the 90s and 2000s they got bad press. I'm thinking particularly of Stephen Kotkin's book Uncivil Society, where part of the argument is that we have paid too much attention to the dissident movements because as early as January 1989, when Václav Havel got out of prison for the last time, led a protest in Prague, and only a few hundred people showed up. By the end of the year, the system itself collapsed. So it can't be from the dissidents that the system collapsed as part of that argument. So the question for you is, were they a success? And if so, how? Did they even consider themselves as a success? How might we counter that belief that they were a phenomenon that it died out by 1982 or so, and then communism went on and something else caused its collapse?
Sure. Well, there are basically three positions that people have taken about the dissidents. And for me, the most important positions are the ones that were taken in Russia, in post-Soviet Russia, and the other non-Russian republics that emerged from the breakup of the Soviet Union. This is I think, an important historical topic, and it fascinated me and still does for many years. But the place where it really matters most, because it's part, or should be part of their own patrimony, is in the former Soviet Union. And the three positions are basically these. Number one, the dissidents were freedom fighters. They helped liberate an enormous society from the control of a dictatorial, single-party, command economy system, and they deserve to go down in history as at least part of the ensemble of people who emancipated the Soviet Union from its own historical legacy. So they get the credit, or at least part of the credit, for dismantling communism. The second position, quite widespread in Russia, beginning in the 1990s and ever since, was the dissidents are horrible people who destroyed a great empire that the whole world respected and feared, and in its place, at least until relatively recently, emerged an ensemble of much weaker states who were not respected geopolitically, who lost the legacy of a superpower status. And I could go on with much nastier versions of blaming the dissidents for causing or helping to cause the collapse of the USSR. And the third position, of which Steve Kotkin, I think, partakes, is, as one Russian colleague put it to me, why are you wasting your time on these people? They didn't matter. They were worked up in a kind of froth of Cold War attention by Western observers, but at the end of the day, those who analyzed the structures of power and the sort of hard core story of how power was lost and won and taken away between 1989 and 1991, the dissidents didn't matter. Kotkin's argument is that, at least for Eastern Europe, it's a story of states going bankrupt, of borrowing too much, failing to properly invest the money that they had borrowed, and essentially just having to declare Chapter 11 on the global stage. So here's my position, and here I'm going to respond directly to your question. The goal of the dissidents in the Soviet Union was to turn that country into a law-abiding state. It was a very clever strategy of saying to the Soviet government, you should obey your own constitution. And for those who are wondering what could that possibly mean in the Soviet setting, the Soviet constitution, the one that was ratified, the first ratified in 1936 at the height of Stalin's rule, subsequently replaced by another one in 1977 under Leonid Brezhnev, but it doesn't really matter, they weren't all that different, surprisingly contained rather robust language about civil liberties. Guarantees of freedom of speech, guarantees of freedom of assembly, guarantees of freedom of the press. It's true that all of those guarantees were bracketed by the demand that they all serve the larger metaphysical goal of building socialism, the cosmic goal of that society, that very purpose-driven society. But the language of guaranteed civil liberties was there. And the dissident strategy was, let's take that language and put real flesh onto it. Let's make it real. Let's make it count. And so whatever they did, they wanted it to be strictly within the bounds of legality, as you said at the outset, as a way of sort of setting an example for the state to do the same. So their goal was to make the Soviet Union a rule of law country. They failed. They completely failed. As a matter of fact, I argue in the book that the Soviet Union became less law-abiding between the 1960s and the 1980s. In the 1960s, Khrushchev had, in effect, removed the use of state-sponsored terror. And remember, terror means the random application of violence so as to instill the maximum degree of fear in the maximum number of people. Because it doesn't matter whether you're guilty or not. It's randomized, so everyone is afraid of being arrested in the middle of the night. Khrushchev's great wager was, stop using mass terror and see if the system can still run on the other two sort of foundations, which is single-party rule, command economy. It turned out it could run. The Soviet Union ran for decades after it stopped being a country where mass terror was practiced by the government against its own citizens. And the KGB was part of that experiment. The KGB in the 1960s very much wanted to distance itself from the traditions of its own predecessor, the so-called NKVD. That was the name of the same organization under Stalin. This was the so-called secret police. The people who carried out campaigns of mass terror, the people who enacted the executions without trial of tens of thousands of people in the basements of prisons in Moscow and other Soviet cities. The KGB by the 1960s was really trying to become a professional intelligence organization. And by then they were no longer randomly arresting people to instill fear. If you were arrested in the Soviet Union from 1960, let's say between 1960 and 1989, it was for a reason. You did something. Maybe what you did wasn't illegal, but it wasn't random. You had done something that either contradicted or appeared to contradict the law. And what the KGB found over and over again with the dissidents is it would arrest them, it would put them on trial, it would get the guilty verdicts that it wanted, and it got the guilty verdicts because the KGB would call the judge in advance of the trial and say, you're going to give so-and-so 5 years and you're going to give so-and-so 7 years. It was all determined before the trial actually happened. But the problem was the PR fallout, the public relations effects of these trials, they were disastrous for the KGB and for the regime. They turned nobodies into martyrs. They turned people that nobody had ever heard of, truly obscure writers and scientists who had the daring to sign open letters, put their names on open letters protesting this or that government policy. They turned them into heroes. 2 of them became Nobel Prize winners. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was not exactly a nobody, but he wasn't really very well known outside the Soviet Union until he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1970, and then he became a household name. Andrei Sakharov was also not exactly a nobody. He was the designer of the Soviet hydrogen bomb, a really world-class nuclear physicist, Nobel Prize in Peace in 1975. But lots of other dissidents who didn't, become marquee names all over the world still achieved brief periods of fame as soon as they got arrested for their dissenting activities. So the KGB was really frustrated. It was trying to play by the new post-Stalinist, post-totalitarian rules and acting like a more or less professional intelligence organization, not torturing people, defendants in criminal cases, that is, not beating them up, not threatening to kill family members. It was getting the guilty verdicts, but the optics were terrible. And after after a couple of dozen trials of dissidents, the KGB essentially threw in the towel and said, the legal system's really not working for us. And so they started to use extrajudicial forms of punishment. You sign that letter, you're fired. You'll never work in your chosen career again. You sign that letter, your children will never get into a Soviet university. It's over. You signed a slightly less damaging letter, your salary will be cut in half starting tomorrow. You signed a letter, you have a week to decide whether we're going to arrest you or you're going to leave the country, and you'll never be able to come back because we're going to strip you of your citizenship. All of these forms of extra-legal punishment, without supervision, without any sanction by the Soviet legal system, the most arbitrary and capricious form of state punishment you can imagine. So it became less law-abiding. But here's the kicker. As so often happens in history, the unintended effects of people's actions can sometimes outweigh what they thought they were fighting for. And the unintended effect of all of those trials and the PR that flowed from them, both within and beyond Soviet borders, was to drain legitimacy from the Soviet system. This was a country, and because you've been studying their propaganda for years, this was a country that literally talked about itself as the avant-garde of human history. This was the most advanced society the world had ever seen, and this was the template that all other societies were destined by the laws of history to follow. The Soviet state could not shut up about itself. It was constantly bragging about this status. Now, it's not a good look for any country to be shown to be repeatedly violating its own constitution. It's just not, it doesn't go over well. But it's especially bad for a country that advertises itself 24/7 as the avant-garde of humanity. And that contrast between the stated claims or the stated image of the country and what the dissidents were able to show over and over again, namely the essential lawlessness of the place, that destroyed gradually over the years the claims to legitimacy. That's why it collapsed so suddenly. It was already hollowed out in that sense. The Soviet Union, and here I differ with Kotkin's interpretation, was not going bankrupt. It was having some serious economic problems, but it was not in crisis. I think it could have gone on for several decades before a true crisis hit. It was the draining of legitimacy from the system that hollowed it out. And when something hollow collapses, it happens super fast. And that's what happened in 1991.
I'm beginning to realize that maybe I shouldn't have spent so much time with Soviet propaganda and maybe a little more time with Soviet dissenters, because their story is a little more inspiring. I have two follow-up questions. So one is, you mentioned Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn by name. They were by far the most famous of the dissenters that got press outside of the Soviet Union. In fact, I learned the word archipelago because my father belonged to a Reader's Digest book club, and we had the Gulag Archipelago, never read, I should add, on the shelf in front of me, and I wanted to know what archipelago meant. Gulag, I didn't even bother because I assumed it was something I shouldn't know. And then Sakharov, of course, got a lot of attention when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, and then eventually when he was released from internal exile in 1985 by Gorbachev. But they both have chapters in your book, but they're not as central to the dissident story as maybe most of us thought they were. Can you explain a little bit?
Yes, I can. You mentioned the title of the book, "The Dissident Toast to the Success of Our Hopeless Cause." The subtitle of the book is "The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement." The title I take no credit for. The dissidents came up with that toast. I just thought it was such a fantastic encapsulation of the tone of their work that I had to use it. But the subtitle is kind of mine, and it reflects the evolution of my own thinking while I was working on this project. I went into it thinking that those two figures would be kind of the stars of the show. And what I learned pretty early on is that neither one of them was the leader of the movement. Neither one of them had the slightest interest in either being or being thought of as the leader of the dissident movement. As a matter of fact, the movement itself was very uncomfortable with the idea that there should be leaders at all. It was a movement that, at least in part, aspired to a purely conscience-driven form of dissent. So no hierarchy within the movement, no formal division of labor, leaders and followers, but rather everyone acting according to his or her beliefs. And what I found was, once I understood that neither Solzhenitsyn nor Sakharov was the leader of the movement, or aspired to be, was that there was a whole cast of characters who had actually built the movement from the ground up, and they were almost entirely forgotten to history. And when I say forgotten, I mean even in today's Russia itself. And we know this from polling data that was done by one of the more reliable polling organizations in Russia, the Levada Center. And I discovered this cast of characters of people who not only created the movement, but also who sustained it over time and kept with it through its various incarnations. So the subtitle of the book is actually a double entendre. It's a play on words. The many lives of the Soviet dissident movement, as in all those people just below the level of Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn, who really were the kind of the grassroots that made it what it was. But the second meaning of the many lives of the Soviet dissident movement is a gesture towards the fact that the movement had several near-death experiences. It was almost crushed several times, and each time it managed to renew itself, but more importantly, reformat itself and become something different structurally, and I think morally, than it had been in its previous incarnation. And I wanted to capture that in the way the book was structured. The last thing that I'll say about the many lives of the Soviet dissident movement is that it hit me one day that the people who at one point or another were held up as either the actual or the symbolic leaders of the movement were all men, without exception. Every single one of the supposed leaders of the movement was a man. And the people who, I wouldn't say anointed them in that role, that would be going a little bit too far, but the people who suggested most powerfully that so-and-so is the unspoken leader of the movement were the Western journalists posted in Moscow, and that was a plum posting if you were a journalist in the 1970s. They sent their top staff to Moscow to cover the Cold War. And don't get me wrong, these people, such as Hedrick Smith for the New York Times and Andrei Shub for the Washington Post, and the list goes on and on. These were extremely talented people. Many of them subsequently produced books about the Soviet Union. They were the ones, because they had such a powerful spotlight to shine on this movement, and because they loved the dissident story. It was one of the most accessible and exciting and morally satisfying stories of the Cold War. They had a huge hand in deciding, or at least implying, who the leaders of this movement were. And then it hit me, every single one of these Western correspondents was also a man. And it was just amazing to see how the women in the movement somehow never seemed like plausible candidates as ostensible leaders. And the more that I dug into the movement's history, the more that I realized that women were a huge part of samizdat networks, creating and presiding over the most important underground dissident journal, the Chronicle of Current Events, which was founded by a poet named Natalia Gorbanevskaya. Part of the reason for the sustained influence of women is that they were less likely to get arrested. The KGB, an overwhelmingly male organization, held the same prejudices as the Western journalists. They assumed that the ringleaders of this conspiratorial movement participated in demonstrations, women participated in the signing of open letters and petitions. So that was kind of a revelation for me, and that's why I gave the book the subtitle that it has.
I want to follow up on that specifically. I still had that other follow-up, but I'll shelve that for a minute here.
Sure.
By the way, had it only been about, or had Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov really been the leaders, this book would be about half of its length. Yeah, but you know, it's better for all the stories you managed to tell in it, because the book, as Ben just said, is about this movement that went through different iterations, that had to revise itself at various points. There's lots of individual stories packed into it, and a lot of really interesting revelations. So one of my favorite moments from the book is when Lyudmila Alexeyeva, one of the women who really did do much to lead the movement, decided to read Lenin for the first time from cover to cover, because Lenin was one of the few things widely available to read, and she'd always ignored him. And in reading him, she describes that how boring he was, how much he contradicted himself, and in this act of reading Lenin came to dislike him even more than she expected to. Which is a wonderful motive, you know, the way in which what is available to you and given to you by the state can backfire spectacularly. So I'm curious, what are some of the most memorable stories you didn't know ahead of time from some of the dissident participants that really stand out to you, that speak to the way in which this movement operated? Kind of like the Alexeyeva reading Lenin story.
Oh, there were so many, because I knew so little when I started. So it was a long and sometimes steep learning curve for me. I do love the technique that historians use of reading other people reading, of watching, you know, what happens when so-and-so reads Freud, or what happens when so-and-so reads Marx or Lenin, or any sort of canonical text that lends itself to different interpretations. You watch someone else read, and when I wasn't literally standing over her shoulder. Obviously, I wasn't born yet when she was doing her reading. But by reading her account of what it is that she extracted from a text, and then you compare it with the text itself, it's the beginnings of being able to reconstruct a mind. Because you see, what did she notice in Lenin? What did she pick out as particularly noteworthy? What did she not see? And the deeper you get into her reading of a text that you yourself can access, the more you can kind of reconstruct the cognitive grid that is operating inside her mind. So it's a fantastic technique for doing intellectual history, to reconstructing thought processes. You know, I did meet Lyudmila Alexeyeva, I interviewed her, but I couldn't take an x-ray of her brain or do brain surgery and, you know, get inside her head, but I could watch her read canonical texts and see how she read them. So I did this for a number of dissidents, because, as you know, she wasn't the only one who had this experience of going back to the founding father, to the sort of the sacred texts of the Soviet experiment, namely Marx, Engels, and Lenin, and they would comment on what they found there and how different it was from what they expected. It was rarely their first encounter with Lenin, because they'd all been forced to read him in school, but it was the first unsupervised reading of Lenin, without a teacher in the classroom telling them what lessons they should draw from it. So these are very revealing moments, and I really, that's the kind of detective work that I love doing as an historian. The other thing that I think was a really powerful moment for me was reading the memoirs of the various people who participated in what was probably the single most famous dissident demonstration, and that's the one that took place on August 25th, Sunday, August 25th, 1968, just 4 days after Soviet tanks had rolled into the city of Prague in Czechoslovakia, a small country with a small border on the Soviet Union's western frontier, an ally of the Soviet Union, part of the Warsaw Pact, but a country that was experiencing its own reform movement, which, at least by content, was rather similar to the Soviet dissident movement, and which really was spooking the leaders in the Kremlin about how far they were going to go. And this was a very dramatic moment in the second half of the Cold War, when Soviet tanks invaded an allied country. It would be like, you know, in the NATO alliance, it would be like France invading Belgium or something, and other NATO countries participating in that invasion. So it was an extraordinary moment. And a group of 8 dissidents, 3 of them women, 5 of them men, some of them very close friends, others had never met each other before. They spent 15 minutes in Red Square, in the symbolic epicenter of the Soviet universe, holding up homemade signs with slogans like "Hands off Czechoslovakia," "Down with the occupiers," and most memorably, this one addressed to their Czech and Slovak compatriots, "For your freedom and for ours," meaning our struggles are joined at the hip, as is the freedom that we're fighting for. Everybody wanted to know, what was going through their minds. Were they hallucinating when they thought they could change Soviet foreign policy by holding up these crude banners? And were they not afraid of being executed for such a provocative act? I mean, it's impossible to overstate the symbolic significance of Red Square. It's the most resonant space in not just the Soviet Union, but the entire second world, the socialist world. It's where everything comes together. Lenin is buried there. That's where the Kremlin is. And so I really wanted to know kind of the psychology that brought them together. And many of those 8 wrote memoirs subsequently, so I had something to go on. I also had interviews and other kinds of material. I spoke with Natalia Gorbanevskaya, I spoke with Ludmila Alexeyeva, I spoke with Pavel Litvinov. And what I learned was amazing, which is that they were under no illusion that, the Politburo gerontocracy was going to walk out of the Kremlin and say, "Oh, thank you guys for correcting us. We had no idea what we were doing. You're absolutely right. We really shouldn't have sent those tanks to Czechoslovakia. We'll pull them out next week." They didn't think they were going to have any practical impact on politics. And what most of them ended up saying by way of explanation was, "I couldn't live with myself if I didn't go out and protest." One of them, Natalia Gorbanevskaya, actually said, "It was an egotistical act on my part. I did it to save my soul because I could not live with myself if I did nothing," to indicate that I was not in agreement with that act. She was under no illusions that she was going to change things in the Soviet Union, certainly not short term. But it was an act of just unadulterated conscience, feeling impelled to do something that most people regarded as suicidal.
I thought it was extraordinary how often people like Gorbanevskaya or Litvinov reckoned with themselves and said they, not just what you just said, but also that they knew they would never be able to answer their children or grandchildren if they hadn't done that. And also how often during the book, how satisfied the dissidents were, not by turnout per se, but by turnout where they didn't know most of the people there, which meant that the word was spreading somehow, and it was a satisfying feeling that others felt similar to them, that they too felt as though they could live freely or have to live within their conscience. And by the way, the sign to your and our freedom is up there in the corner.
There it is. Yeah.
I want to follow up with that follow-up question. So one of the other things that surprised me, maybe I shouldn't have been so surprised in reading the book, was how much we learn in reading it about the ways in which the Soviet state itself operated after Stalin's death. You already alluded to the fact that the Soviet state grew less violent, but then became more violent because of the dissident movement. You describe it, for example, as a lip service state after 1953, and I think one of the most interesting moments for me was how you write about the KGB's Fifth Directorate, that is the wing within the KGB assigned to infiltrate the dissidents, arrest them, interrogate them. Its most famous member, of course, by the way, was Vladimir Putin. What they did and how they interviewed dissidents itself reflects larger change within the Soviet Union. Can you talk a little bit about that, the way in which the Soviet state evolved because of the dissidents?
Yeah. I really did want to take the KGB seriously in this book and not just dismiss it as some kind of evil force. I wanted to see the world through the KGB's eyes. And of course, I was covetous of KGB archival materials because there was no institution or entity anywhere in the world that was more interested in the dissident story than the KGB, for obvious reasons. They were enemies, and they wanted to learn everything they could about what the dissidents were up to and who was behind them and everything that they could learn about them. So you're right to mention the Fifth Directorate. This was the unit of the KGB that was founded in June of 1967 as a response to this new phenomenon, not just of dissent, but of constitutionalist dissent. This was another head scratcher for the KGB. You know, they had, by the 1960s, they had lots of experience dealing with underground monarchist movements and underground fascist movements and even underground neo-Leninist movements, people who were sort of, you know, more Catholic than the Pope in the Soviet setting, who thought the Soviet state had gone off the rails, and if we could only get back to the original promise of Lenin in 1917, everything would be hunky-dory. They had lots of experience dealing with those people, and they knew how to disarm them and neutralize them. What they had no experience with was people who held up signs, one of which is at the top center of this screen, saying, "Respect the Constitution of the USSR." Well, that seems pretty innocuous. Are you really going to arrest someone for holding up a sign that says respect the Soviet Constitution? So it took a while for them to get their bearings with this movement, and the Fifth Directorate was an attempt to sort of form a professional unit that would deal with this new phenomenon. And just to reiterate what you said, lots of people who've done any digging on the biography of Vladimir Putin know that his career was in the KGB. That's where he came up professionally. And they know, because Putin has spoken about it, that he was stationed in Dresden, in East Germany, at the sort of the western frontier of the Soviet Empire. What they generally don't know, because Putin doesn't like to talk about it, is that earlier in his career, he worked in the Fifth Directorate in the Leningrad branch. So his brief was suppressing dissidents. He was directly implicated in the KGB's handling of dissent. What did the KGB learn? Well, as I said earlier, they went into it on the assumption that this must be a conspiratorial movement that has leaders. And one of the most amazing documents that I found in the KGB archive, not the central one in Moscow, because I couldn't get into that one, but I got into the back door of other KGB archives. What I found was a picture that the Leningrad branch had drawn of what it imagined the structure of the dissident movement in that city looked like. That's the city that's today called St. Petersburg. It's the former imperial capital. And it looks exactly like the diagrams that network theorists draw. It has a couple of circles and then spokes emanating out of that circle, and then smaller circles at the end of those spokes, and then some of those smaller circles are themselves hubs of other networks of distribution. And what this was an attempt to create a spatial map of the networks of distribution of uncensored, quasi-legal, hand-typed texts. And I don't know if is there a spoiler alert here with samizdat?
No, go ahead, Gyoto.
Okay. So samizdat is this technique of, the word means self-publishing, or I published it myself. And for people who wrote things that they felt sure would never pass the censorship system in the Soviet Union, the way to distribute them was you would have a stack of very, very thin onion skin paper. You take one sheet of that and one sheet of carbon paper and then another onion skin, carbon alternating, and you know, it could be 6 deep, it could be 10 deep. Some people said they could actually get them 16 sheets deep, and you would take that raft of paper and you would wind it around what's called the platen of a typewriter. You guys know what typewriters are? You do. Good. Typewriter, right? So you wound this stack of paper around a typewriter, and then someone has given you a novel or a poem or an essay, or it could be anything, any genre imaginable, and you have 24 hours to read it, which means you're doing a lot of binge reading. And as you're reading, as your payment for the privilege of having access to that text for a day, you are typing multiple copies, and you're really typing hard. You're pounding on the keys because you've got 6 or 10 or 16 layers to go through with a single keystroke. And I have spoken to people who were typists of samizdat text, and they said, by the time you get done typing a novel in samizdat, you've got shoulders like a lumberjack because you're pounding the typewriter keys, and it's like a chain letter. So you start with one copy, which you have to return to the person who gave it to you, and in response to that, you produce, let's say, 10 copies that you give to trusted friends, and they too are under the obligation to multiply it. So this was a system of textual multiplication and dissemination. Way better than the internet as a technology of free speech. Why? Okay, it was very crude. It was all handmade. If you look at a piece of samizdat today, you will not be impressed. It's ragged at the edges. There's a lot of ink smudging. There's some human, sweat and grease on it. It's not impressive visually. But this technology, unlike the internet, had no owner. Nobody owned it. If you had a typewriter, you could be part of the network of samizdat distribution. But there was no central server owned by Google or Amazon or Facebook or the Russian government or the Chinese government. And nobody could intervene in the dissemination of samizdat to block certain texts or certain words or certain concepts. It was a remarkably radical, anarchic technology of free speech. Very, very inspiring. I'm occasionally asked, well, how big was this movement? How many people actually participated in it? And the answer is the number of core activists, as our metric, if we take the people who signed open letters and petitions, who were willing to put their names out there and sometimes their addresses and phone numbers, was probably never more than 1,000, which is pretty tiny in a country that by 1970 had 250 million people in it. It's a drop in the ocean. But if you ask me how many people were part of the networks of distribution of samizdat texts, who either copied them or read them or typed them or produced them as writers, then I would say it's in the tens of thousands, at least 25,000. And those people could be found in every even medium-sized town across the entire Soviet Union. And remember, this is a ginormous country, 11 time zones, 6,000 miles from Moscow to the Pacific coast, to Vladivostok. And why am I speaking with such confidence about the number of people and their geographic distribution? The KGB did my research for me. They investigated these networks. Obviously, they wanted to know who was partaking in this kind of network of communication. And they produced the data that I just cited to you. Minimum 25,000 people in every medium to large size city. So there's the inner concentric circle of the sort of 1,000 core activists. Then there's the next concentric circle of producers and consumers of samizdat. And then beyond that is the population of Soviet citizens who had an entirely different technology of access to samizdat. And that was when some samizdat texts were smuggled outside the Soviet Union, some of them made their way into the offices of the shortwave radio broadcasters, most of them financed by Western governments in the Cold War, sometimes by intelligence services like the CIA. You know their names: Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, BBC, Deutsche Welle, the West German service, Kol Israel, the shortwave radio station broadcast from Tel Aviv. And when these radio stations got samizdat texts in their possession, they would broadcast them back to the Soviet Union. This is what we now call an audiobook. Now, I don't have good, solid, reliable numbers for how many Soviet citizens were listening to samizdat, but the anecdotal evidence is that it was overwhelmingly popular. Probably tens of millions of Soviet citizens were tuning into these Western shortwave radio broadcasts. The Soviet Union was a highly technically literate society. a lot of well-trained engineers and scientists, people who in an hour could transform an FM radio into a shortwave radio. So the ability to pick up those broadcasts was very widespread. So in fact, there was a massive audience for samizdat as it was filtered through these Western radio stations.
But I'm supposed to lob you softball questions. Ben actually lobbed me one because he said, is it a spoiler alert to talk about samizdat? When Ben came upstairs to the Having Her Center today, he got there right as Amazon delivered carbon paper, and he asked me, oh, are you going to make samizdat with this?
I was joking.
As a joke, and I said, yes, as a matter of fact, we are. The Having Her Center is sponsoring, not quite 2 weeks from today, a samizdat lab over in Makerspace in the library. We have bought old typewriters. We have a Russian typewriter. We have a lot of carbon paper. We're going to try to replicate these samizdat networks on our own in 2 weeks' time.
Wish I could be there.
You will drive on over. I feel like I could keep talking to you forever, Ben. I'm reminded today how much I enjoy talking to you and how much I enjoy hearing you talk. But I am cognizant of the time here. I want to at least have time for a couple questions from the audience, and certainly time for anyone who wants to buy a book and have it signed and maybe ask Ben a question of their own to do so. So let's throw it open to the floor for at least a couple questions, and then we'll have time for book citing.
I'll throw out a question, maybe a couple of questions here. You can kind of pick the one you want to answer. One, the Soviet Union reconquered the Baltic states, 1940, Eastern Poland. You also had, obviously talk about the Soviet Union as an empire, obviously a lot of Asian khanates and other things like that conquered over the years. Did the dissident movement differ between, let's say, Russia proper and the other Soviet socialist republics? And then the other question I might throw out at you is, how did, I guess, the Soviet legal system out there, you mentioned how it changed, a bit from the Stalinist era, but I listened to your China Talk podcast.
Oh, yeah.
October 4th, which I would highly recommend to everybody there. And the one thing that surprised me was that they actually allowed the general public into these trials. And I was just fascinated by some of the source material that we got from the witnesses to the trials, and we're able to compare those to the KGB transcripts. So kind of talk about how you found out about that too. I thought that was just fascinating.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Those are excellent questions. And you reminded me about my answer to the first question was incomplete. There's another reason why the dissidents didn't think of themselves as political animals, and that was that while they could all unify behind the idea of the rule of law and appealing to the Soviet Constitution, underneath that consensus was a very wide range of political beliefs. There were neo-communists in the movement. There were a few anti-communists in the movement. There were people who were very admiring of Western multi-party democracies. There were people who were not at all impressed with the political mess that those democracies produced. And I think one incentive to understand themselves as apolitical was so that they didn't have to deal with their own political differences. And this brings up the question of, what about people in the Baltic states or in Ukraine who were also advocating, in some cases earlier than the Moscow-based dissenters, advocating for fundamental changes in the system. So this is a thorny issue. Most of the movements that surfaced in the non-Russian republics, above all Lithuania and Ukraine, were national in orientation. They were advocating for some degree of greater autonomy, up to and including full-blown secession from the Union. Many of those movements adopted the language of the rule of law because it was, in a way, a convenient facade for what was in fact a profoundly political agenda. The rule of law, the strategy of using the Soviet Constitution as a form of containment vis-a-vis the Soviet state, became the lingua franca of the movement across the Union. It wasn't just a Russian phenomenon. And by the way, there was a nationalist movement in the Russian Federated Republic as well. It was much weaker and less articulate than the Ukrainian and Lithuanian ones, but there were Russian nationalists, and they too kind of glommed on to this language of legality because it gave them a place to stand and to present themselves to the leadership and to society as a legal phenomenon. Like they weren't breaking Soviet law. That was a very appealing stance to take. The trouble is that at the end of the day, those movements wanted much more than just the rule of law. They either wanted a form of cultural autonomy or outright separation. And that meant that in the sort of ultimate question of political ends, political goals, they did not align well with the dissident movement. The dissidents did not aspire to change the Soviet state structurally. They were not about regime change. They were not about overthrowing the Politburo. Most of them had no interest in economic matters and therefore had no problem with socialism as a way of organizing the economy. They had a minimalist agenda. Abide by your own rules. You really couldn't say that of the various nationalist movements. So there was a meaningful distinction. And I think one of the most consistent complaints I've got about my book is that it doesn't pay enough attention to the non-Russian components. And my answer to that, it's a little bit self-serving, but the first part of my answer is I'm using the word dissident in the Soviet meaning of the word. People who defended the rights of fellow citizens based on constitutional civil liberties. The other part of my response to that is, the book's already 800 pages. Like, you really wanted me to make it longer? That's a worthy subject for a different book. Your second question was, what was your second question about?
About the allowing regular people into the
Oh, yes, thank you.
trials.
Right, and the transcripts, yeah.
Took themselves to the trial.
So it's actually not quite accurate to say that they allowed the general public into the courtroom. The KGB very carefully sort of stocked the courtroom with its people who would be on the side of the prosecution and hostile to the defendants. But there was a law that even the KGB, in its lawless version in the 1970s, never crossed, and that was the spouses of the defendants had to be allowed into the courtroom. And in the very first significant trial of dissidents in 1966, the two wives of the defendants, they were both obscure writers, Andrei Sinyavsky and Yulia Daniel, the two wives were permitted to be in the courtroom, Larisa Bogoraz and Maria Razanova. Now, Bogoraz had a PhD in linguistics, and it turns out was an exceptionally gifted shorthand taker. And she's the one who produced the unofficial transcript of that trial. That transcript was obviously taken with handwriting in the courtroom, and then overnight, in between courtroom sessions, her friends would type it up, and it became part of the samizdat distribution network. It's once that samizdat document went viral, as we would say now, was smuggled abroad, translated into English, German, French, Italian, Japanese, you name it. The dissidents essentially invited the world into the trial by creating a transcript of exactly what had been said. But it's not really true that the public was allowed into the courtroom itself. The dissidents, I would say brilliantly, made it a public trial after the trial was over, to devastating effect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Time for one more question. We'll give it to Alexa. But of course, questions for those who want to come up afterwards.
So I'm in Dr. Norris's class about the use of Soviet propaganda throughout the Stalinist era. And we've been told a lot about his cartoonist, Boris Efimov, and all of the importance of crocodile, of satire, of the shifting way that cartoonists had to dance around those changing standards. So I was wondering, you talked a lot about the literary distribution and how that worked, but I'm wondering, was art and satire in an art, in a form, like a Kilroy was here kind of thing, was that kind of any big part of the dissident movement, or was it much more literary focused?
It was highly textual because its clientele was the highly text-centric Russian intelligentsia or Soviet intelligentsia. So yes, the word was privileged above all else. But there was a very lively, unofficial underground art scene that, and you're going to, one of its greatest practitioners, Vitaly Komar, is coming to Miami University later this
November 3rd.
semester,
Yep.
November 3rd to be precise. You really want to hear this guy. He's not only a great artist, but he's an unbelievably gifted speaker. And he and dozens of other artists created very memorable and in a few cases reproducible images or graffiti or cartoons that were, I would say, consonant with the dissident message. If you think about it, it's really hard to come up with a visual representation of the idea of the rule of law. However, Komar and his co-conspirator Vitaly Melamed, no, not Vitaly.
Melamud.
Sorry?
Melamud.
Melamud, this team of artists that worked together, they actually created a piece that was a coded version of the articles in the Soviet Constitution guaranteeing civil liberties. I have a poster of it in my office at Penn. It's amazing. These guys were absolutely brilliant and very, very funny. But serious works of art are often very difficult to reproduce. And some of the works were quite large. So they weren't formatted in a way that led them to the samizdat technology. That having said, I found, that being said, I found in the archives samizdat crosswords in which the keywords were all from the dissident lexicon, like transparency, rule of law, gulag, dissident. You know, so people came up with very inventive ways of visually capturing the themes that animated this remarkable group of people. You're welcome.
I'm writing down samizdat crosswords because we're going to do this.
I have a photocopy of it.
We're doing it. Ben, thank you so much for joining us. Let's thank Ben again. Please, everyone, Chris and Jenny drove from Madeira to sell copies of this Pulitzer Prize winning book so that the Pulitzer Prize winning author can sign them. Please take advantage of it.